Our second lesson this morning is from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 14, verses 13 through 21. As you're able, I invite you to please stand and let us honor the reading of the Gospel today. This is right after Jesus hears about his cousin John the Baptist being executed by King Herod. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled, and they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides the women and the children. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. It's been a while since we've done this. We're going to talk about blessings this morning. So I want to take just a couple of minutes or so and have you turn to each other, maybe turn to a couple people around you. If you don't know the people around you, please take a moment to introduce yourselves and just share what is a blessing that you have received or experienced recently. It could be a small thing, but something that blessed you. So share your blessings. Ready? You have 90 seconds and go. Got about 30 seconds. Okay, let's come back together. And we'll take a moment. We'll take a moment to share what are the blessings that are gathered here. What are some blessings? A new grandson this year. All right. What else?
My son is cured of his liver disease, and he's strong, and I guess it's cured.
The blessing of healing for your son?
He has passed through all that, and it's because of you all and your prayers.
Yeah. Yes, Jim?
Good friend of ours in the church is Nelson Young. Had a trach taken out this week. A swallow was put in,
Yeah, wonderful. Blessing for a friend who's making some progress. What else? The blessing of worshiping here, worshiping in this community. Blessings of friends and community in time of need.
Having the blessing for having our basic needs met, food, shelter, clothing.
Having the basic needs, the blessings of that, yeah. Blessings of cards, of appreciation, very blessed with that. So we're going to talk about blessings today, and more specifically how sometimes blessings come from brokenness. Matthew says Jesus is out in the wilderness. It seems he has intentionally wandered away for solitude and for prayer. He's been informed that his cousin John the Baptist has died. He's been executed by the King Herod. And so presumably Jesus might be grieving. Sometimes in the Gospels, Jesus will withdraw from the disciples or from the crowds for a time of solitude and for a time of prayer. But Matthew says that the crowds follow Jesus into the wilderness, and before you know it, it's dinner time. And there's no food except for a few biscuits and some fish sticks. Now, it's helpful to know that in the first century ancient Mediterranean world, food scarcity was rampant. The rich and the elite had adequate access to 3 meals a day. The poor and the destitute were lucky to get 3 meals a week. It makes the promise in the Lord's Prayer of daily bread that much more poignant. We might assume that some of this crowd who are following Jesus, they are also grieving the loss of John. John, we are told, was the voice of the one crying out in the wilderness, the one who was heralding God's coming one, who would bring redemption and renewal, who would bring hope. That voice has now been silenced. The crowd is not simply following the celebrity Messiah in the hopes of getting a free miraculous meal. They are following Jesus out of desperation. They are looking for hope. They are wandering around hopeless, which is why Jesus looks at them with compassion. Matthew specifically says he sees the crowd and he has compassion on them. And that English word that we translate as compassion, that's a nice word. It's a pleasant word, but it really doesn't give you the fullness of the emotion that Jesus was experiencing. The Greek word behind this word compassion, one of my favorite Greek words is Splanchnizomai. Aren't you glad you came here just for that? If you've learned nothing from this sermon, Splanchnizomai is compassion, and it literally is translated as gut-wrenching. It literally means in the bowels, to be moved in the bowels. It is gut-wrenching. Jesus looks upon the crowd and he is gut-wrenched. Splanchnizomai. Jesus looks at the crowds and sees compassion. He experiences compassion. When the disciples look at the crowds, they see potential freeloaders, people who should have planned better, who could have packed their own meal, or maybe they should have just stayed home, lived within their means, not depend on handouts. But when Jesus looks at them, he is moved. He has compassion. The disciples tell Jesus to send the crowds back home. Let them buy their own food. Let them fend for themselves. Survival of the fittest and all that. And in response, Jesus looks at the disciples and says, "Oh, they don't need to go home. Y'all can feed them." Which is why the disciples are a bit confused or surprised. Now, Matthew does not tell us exactly how this miracle happened, how a meager amount of fish and bread fed a crowd of thousands. Jesus seems to be fulfilling a prophecy about the Messiah, how the Messiah would feed the hungry in the wilderness. And that is certainly something that is deserving of attention here. But also, there's another focus in this text. What makes this meal in the wilderness interesting is that it could be a parody of another meal that preceded it. It helps to know that what comes before this passage, we are told that John the Baptist has been killed. We know that John the Baptist was killed. He was executed during a meal in the court of Herod, at a dinner party that was attended by the rich and the elite. And in a drunken oath, the king has John the Baptist beheaded and his head displayed on a platter for all to see. Now, this is not a polite childhood story we're reading here. What makes this meal interesting is that it could be a parody of Herod's meal. One minute, Matthew is focusing on a lavish party where only the 1% were invited, where death was on display. And the next minute, Matthew turns our attention to a very different meal, a banquet that took place not in a palatial court, but outside in the wilderness. And it was a party that was not exclusive with a limited guest list. It was a meal that had an open invitation that echoed the words of the prophet Isaiah, who said, "Come, all who are hungry and thirsty." It was a banquet where what looked like scarcity turned out to be abundance in the hands of Jesus. It was a banquet where life and not death was on display, where Israel's true king was fulfilling the promises of God that the sick would be healed and the poor would be fed and the downtrodden would be lifted up. It was a party in which unwilling disciples became willing servants, where gifts were taken and collected and blessed, and where gifts were then broken and then dispersed, given out. And we see this as God's pattern for life. God takes reluctant people sometimes and uses them for God's good purposes. God takes and breaks and then blesses and then gives out. And we see this in the first lesson that we read from Genesis in the story of Jacob. Remember Jacob, the conniver, the schemer, the cheater who stole his father's blessing from his brother Esau, and who also convinced his dim-witted brother to trade his birthright for a bowl of stew. Jacob, who lied and swindled his uncle. Jacob was someone who wheeled and dealed his way through life to get what he wanted. He runs away from home to escape his brother Esau's wrath. And now, sometime later, he is returning home, and he receives word that his brother Esau is headed right towards him, and he has with him 400 men. And so Jacob does what any good brother would do. He sends bribes to his brother, one bribe on the hour, every hour, in the hopes of winning and securing a brotherly truce. And he does what countless people who have done throughout history who find themselves in a tight spot. He prays, "Lord, if you will get me out of this, I promise you, I will do better, I will be better. Just help me out this one time." And Jacob enlists God into his cause, reminding God of the promises that God made to multiply Jacob's descendants. Notice that Jacob does turn to God in prayer, but he also hedges his bets by sending bribes to his brother. Jacob is still leaning on his own strength, getting by his wits. Jacob is still thinking that he has to take matters into his own hands to make things come out right, instead of entrusting his life to the good purposes of God, instead of trusting that God will come through. And then that night by the Jabbok River, a mysterious stranger appears and wrestles with Jacob throughout the night. and he tears a muscle in Jacob's hip, but Jacob still won't let him go. Jacob, ever the bargainer, tells the man, "I'll let you go if you bless me." And the man gives Jacob a new name, Israel, which means one who struggles or wrestles with God. Jacob walks away from the encounter with a limp, but also with a new name and a blessing. In the encounter with this mysterious stranger, Jacob is broken, and then he is blessed. He is broken of his addiction to secure his own life by his own wits and by his own conniving. He is broken of the belief that he is the captain of his own fate. He is broken so that he might receive blessing and be a blessing. And that turns out to be the pattern of life that God intends for all of God's people. God enlists reluctant people into his good purposes. God takes us, breaks us, so that we can become a blessing. One pastor, Greg Boyd, says, God often uses our deepest pain as the launching pad for our greatest calling. God sometimes uses our deepest pain as the launching pad for our greatest calling. A number of years ago, I was talking with an older pastor, a good friend of mine, who retired a number of years ago. And at the time, he had gone through a very painful divorce. And he admitted to me, he said, there were times in my ministry when I would look down on divorced people, and especially pastors. I was just convinced that pastors should just try harder. They just didn't try hard enough. They just didn't stay in the game. They should in some way just be a little ashamed. And he said, that was my attitude until one day my wife walked into the living room and said, I can't do this anymore. And at that moment and the days afterwards, I realized there was no amount of trying again and again. There was no sticking in the game that was going to change the course of events. And he said, now, because of that deeply painful event, I see divorced people in a whole new light. I don't judge. I have a lot more compassion and understanding. I have a deeper comprehension that life isn't as black and white as I once thought it was. Having gone through that painful ordeal, he had been broken. But out of that brokenness came blessing. Ernest Hemingway once said, the world breaks us, and we are stronger in the broken places. When Jesus looked upon the crowd, he was Splanchnizomai, moved with compassion. It was the same feeling he felt when he encountered a father who had a sick son who needed healing. He was gut-wrenched when he saw two blind men. He had compassion. He was moved when he met a widow whose only son had died. Jesus told parables about a master who forgives an enormous debt from one of his servants. A father welcoming home a wayward son. And he told about a good Samaritan. All of these persons, all of these characters were described as, in some way, as Splanchnizomai, gut-wrenched, moved with compassion. Jesus shows us a Father who is patient, long-suffering, who looks upon humanity, and he is not moved to hurl lightning bolts or rain down fire upon his creation, but who is moved with compassion because we were held captive by the power of sin. And Jesus shows us a God who is not motivated by wrath, but who is filled with so much compassion that God would do anything to get us back. even breaking himself or allowing himself to be broken. Years ago, I read the story about a man named Guo Gantong, whose son was kidnapped in front of the family home in a province in China in 1997 when the child was just 2 years old. Guo Gantong was a determined father who spent the next 24 years traveling over 300,000 miles, crisscrossing China on a motorbike, searching for his son. During his search, he was sometimes injured, he was sometimes robbed. He spent most of the family's savings, at times even begging for spare change just to buy gas for his motorbike. He carried photos of his son wherever he went. He chased down many leads, many of which were false or dead ends. But one lead in particular eventually led to the identification of his son's kidnappers and eventually led the father to find his son and reclaim him as his own. And Jesus tells us that that's the kind of Father in heaven we all have. That's the kind of Father every human being has. From the lifelong churchgoer to those who've never set foot in a church, from the addict to the teetotaler, from the staunch believer to the staunch atheist, every person is sought after by this persistent Father who is determined to have a family, who does not use divine power to move heaven and earth, but rather who moves from heaven to earth in order to get back to us, in order to reclaim us. And God does this not out of anger. When God looks upon the world, he is Splanchnizomai, gut-wrenched with compassion, broken by love. Thanks be to God for this good news. Amen.